So what we have right now with these tariff policies from the United States is in breach of those commitments, both at the WTO level right now and through various trade agreements like the USMCA, where the United States is clearly imposing tariffs beyond their commitments. And in doing so, they're supposed to go through a rebalancing process, but they're not.
All the headlines about these tariffs have been of trade wars and the world disintegrating. Are there any positives?
Are there any positives to the trade actions from the United States?
Yes, absolutely, yes.
Uh, I think it's too soon to tell, really. Honestly, I mean, people may not realize it, but we're not even 100 days into the second Trump administration. So, in terms of finding positives, it's difficult to even identify that because we don't fully understand the gravity of what the negatives will be. So, that would be my first instinct. I think ultimately it's clear, and this is not just from the current Trump administration, but even further back, several different administrations, that the United States has taken concern with its role in global markets and the way that it conducts trade with other economies. And to that extent, it has been seeking to redesign, to some extent, the way that it engages with trading partners, to the extent that normally a negotiation about future looking trade is often something of actually a compromise between two economies, then it can be really beneficial sometimes to revisit and review. This allows for governments to adjust to sort of the post-digital age, things also that have happened in the world with respect to the pandemic or to focusing on climate change, and just the way that we think about efficiency and growth and security in a new period is a part of that. I think this time around, it's difficult to yet see the benefits or the positive because we're in this sort of intense period of uncertainty. And policy uncertainty isn't something that can allow negotiating partners to understand what the asks are, right? You want to negotiate and make concessions and start from a position where you have a sense of where you want to end up. And I think right now, a lot of the policies have been sort of coming at it from lots of different angles, which makes it difficult to identify the positives of the situation. So I'll leave it at that.
Can you give us an understanding of how trade arrangements between countries or blocs are sort of created? Are they written down in some sort of agreement? Are they set in law? And if so, how can Donald Trump effectively just rip up those agreements on a whim?
Hopefully not on a whim. Hopefully there's some thought to them. But yes, okay. So let me explain. So really, international law, you can imagine it as a framework, right? And there's lots of different ways or different layers, I think, to that framework. If we're thinking about, different dimensions to it. So we have at the international level, governments negotiate agreements between themselves, and that can be bilaterally. So an example, to think about is sort of the United States agreement with South Korea. It can also be regional, where several economies will come together and agree on particular rules governing trade and services and goods. So the North American Free Trade Agreement, now the United States, Mexico, Canada agreement, focused on the region, that sort of upper region of North America. You can also have a larger group of economies that are not regionally close together, but that unite in sort of positions on opening markets for trade in goods and services. The Trans-Pacific Partnership it's now the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, CPTPP, lots of acronyms in trade, which is a huge group of different economies. And then finally, the multilateral level, sort of the big overarching umbrella for all this. And that is the World Trade Organization and the agreements that come under that purview. That is an agreement, a legal system, really, that was created after the Second World War. And it's a part of that sort of logic coming out of the Second World War with the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, this desire to create a global institution and a global set of rules. Now, they don't tell governments what they can and cannot do in terms of pursuing security or other public policies, but they sort of set baselines in terms of seeking to not discriminate between goods that come from one trading partner versus another, not to discriminate between your own domestic products and that of a foreign product, so that when you walk into a supermarket, you're trying to buy the best quality or the one that suits your budget, but not necessarily because of where it came from. The other aspect of this, of course, is also how governments set agreements between themselves, almost like a balancing of scales, where they open up markets in exchange for another economy's opening a market. So you negotiate how you restrict trade in a sort of in a very organized, calculated way, where you can have border measures like tariffs that are set on particular goods, and you agree to eventually, through negotiations, ratchet those down. So what we have right now with these tariff policies from the United States is in breach of those commitments, both at the WTO level right now and through various trade agreements like the USMCA, where the United States is clearly imposing tariffs beyond their commitments. And in doing so, they're supposed to go through a rebalancing process, but they're not. They're just sort of raising their tariffs. And it's predominantly been tariffs that we've seen, but there are lots of ways, of course, that governments can restrict trade, both at the border and also once a good is inside a territory.
So on the basis that that it does appear to be breaches, how
Alleged breaches, I should say.
yes, sure, but okay, well, on that basis, you'd think that they would be open to legal challenges. So how
That's
and where might they come from, and how come, perhaps on a whim was the wrong phrase, but certainly in terms of a time scale, it can decide it happens and it happens immediately, given
yeah.
that there are potential legal challenges to this, I would have thought.
Right. So we have seen various governments already to bring disputes to the World Trade Organization, so Canada and the European Union, because they are represented as a group by the Commission. So there have been disputes brought. China has also brought disputes with respect to United States policies right now. And so why I said alleged is that they haven't been technically reviewed yet to determine legality. But obviously, you can sort of make a call based on looking at what the actions have done in terms of have they gone past the bounds of what the United States committed to or not. So there is this question of going through that process. And this comes back, I think, to two things. One, we've seen these policies develop very rapidly, but also we've seen this period just in the first few months where tariffs are threatened, tariffs are imposed, tariffs are pulled back, or there is a threat of a future date where tariffs will be put into place. And there are lots of theories going around as to why this sort of inconsistency exists. And some of it is to do with the belief that these are leverage points. These are negotiating points. You sort of hit hard and then begin to negotiate. Some of them are also with respect to the United States' own perspective of seeking to replace income tax with external revenue from tariffs. And so the mix of these makes it very complicated because, in fact, some of these views contradict one another. So if you're using it as leverage, you expect the tariffs to be taken off. It can't be the case that they're also being judged as an additional revenue for the United States. So there's some inconsistency there in terms of that. But yes, governments have brought disputes. This, of course, depends upon the viability of the WTO dispute settlement mechanism. And as I'm sure you've heard, there is supposed to be an appellate review that could give a final assessment if one of the panels in one of these future cases was sort of incorrect on the law. There's an opportunity to correct or clarify the law in that respect. That current appellate body mechanism doesn't exist. So now any government that has not signed up to some of the alternative workarounds that have been put into place can block a report they disagree with. And this is, of course, what we've seen from the United States since 2019, where they are able to block a report, particularly on questions of security that they disagree with. So in the past, we've already had review of United States security measures taken to protect security interests through trade action. That has been seen as not in compliance, that they weren't able to justify their actions based on the security exceptions that are available at the WTO. And the response from the United States was our assessment of when we invoke security for trade actions is not subject to review, and therefore they appealed essentially into the void. That's how it's called at the WTO. basically preventing some of the countries that had brought the cases from implementing and enforcing their rights through the WTO system.
It sounds then like the WTO, even if they do determine that some of these rules have been breached, are a
Yeah.
bit toothless. Is that fair?
I don't think they're toothless. I think that this comes down to sort of what is the role of international law and international trade law at the moment. I think it's still incredibly important for governments to continue to use the multilateral system to bring disputes, to challenge the United States, that is still a member of the World Trade Organization, to say you have acted in compliance with your commitments and your rights. I think that in doing so, they're leading a signal of what that means in terms of US participation. To the extent that they are not able legally through the system to retaliate, this creates a lot of potential problems. If a government wants to retaliate and they want to do so quickly in response to United States tariffs with their own counter tariffs, right, to sort of stop the war from trade war, so-called trade war, from escalating, governments may not want to wait for 2 years. So in fact, we see different governments taking different approaches. Canada, for example, because of several other issues that are coming to play with the Canadian and American trade relations, United States trade relations, but more broadly, the political relations, they have imposed response immediately while also bringing a dispute. The European Union has argued that these are safeguards to protect United States interests, and through the safeguards agreement, they are able to respond right away. Now, the United States is not actually calling their measures safeguard measures. They're saying they're security measures, to the extent that it's with respect to autos and steel and aluminum. So there are all these different responses. Some governments are not yet responding to either, with either a dispute or with retaliation. But in terms of, is it toothless? I don't think so. I think it's important to have those engagements, to participate, to ask the United States to justify its actions within the community of international members that are participating. To the extent that everything is sort of also a question of power and dynamics and negotiation, I mean, that's a part of the sort of part of politics, of international politics. And yet it still remains that if the goal is cooperation and engagement, then consultation through these multilateral challenges remain important. It's sort of this question of, it's not the end game that matters, it's that process of how you get there. Well, that still very much applies. The requirement of engaging with the United States through this process is just as valuable as it is to do so outside of the terms. But at least in this way, it's done through the community of WTO membership.
But to be absolutely clear, there are no punishments necessarily that could be, leveraged against the United States.
I mean, this is a community of sovereign states, right? And to that extent, it doesn't operate in terms of punishment. The way that I explain to my students how the World Trade Organization works is that ultimately, if the remedies for a WTO dispute are not punitive or compensatory damages in the same way you would see in a domestic court, how it works is that if a government action is seen as inconsistent with WTO rules, the remedy is to bring themselves back into compliance. So you try to get back to that sense of equilibrium. Because governments change policies and have to protect industries all the time. And that's not what the WTO is designed to prohibit in any way. They're there to sort of acknowledge that if you set sort of an equilibrium with your trading partners, you have to get back to that. Because sometimes governments are not aware of how their actions may harm the interests of producers in a different country. It's the job of that country to voice their concerns of their industry to their trading partner. So the remedy is to bring back into compliance. So in fact, the entire dispute settlement system is exactly as I said, a negotiation, a calibration back into compliance, where governments are sometimes not able to respond if, for example, the US blocks a report. What happens is that normally, if a government doesn't bring their measure back into compliance, they just say, sorry, we hear you, but we don't want to change anything. Then there's an opportunity for the member that brought the complaint to impose sort of temporary concessions where either they take away market access from the member to sort of, again, rebalance, or they seek from that member concessions in another sector to again rebalance, because it's all about those scales. If the US blocks, they're in effect saying, we don't want to participate with that process. And so that is a bigger position of sort of distancing themselves from other economies and willing to engage. And it might be that they do so because they want to negotiate bilaterally. They want to do so in an opaque, sort of closed door way, not through the WTO system. It may be that they have no interest in that negotiation at all. It may be that with some partners they're willing, with others not. So we don't have the full answers for that.
That's sort of, the international level.
Mm-hmm.
I want to take you more to sort of, international companies leveled rather
Okay.
than nations.
Mm-hmm.
Say I've got a contract. I'm an American firm
Yep.
to buy a particular product from another country for the next 5 years. Suddenly that becomes prohibitively expensive because of these tariffs that I now can't fulfill that contract.
Yeah.
What actually happens there? Are there, I mean, I suppose it depends on each individual contract, but are there get outs for those sorts of agreements? This could have international legal ramifications at a much sort of more micro level, couldn't it?
Yeah. I mean, I can't speculate on that. I mean, ultimately, that is a contract. That's a domestic law question, right? In terms of how a firm can adjust to a change of circumstances. And there are contractual commitments that have to be put into play and clauses that could be there. Ultimately, though, this is a question of how does it impact firms, right? Firms generally want to be able to scale up. The whole point and the benefits of global economic integration is that you can specialize and expand and work with other firms in various jurisdictions to be able to grow and reach new markets. And ultimately, this is now we're in a system where markets have a very heavy hand from governments in terms of dictating policy. And it means that firms may have to make decisions that they would not normally make, right? It may mean that they have to work with certain partners within a certain jurisdiction rather than who they had intended to. And that ultimately, with economic theory, means that they're not basing it on efficiency reasons. They may be basing it on political ones. And that's sort of with outside the bounds of sort of understanding the public-private relationship in markets. And that is a new question. We've been seeing more and more of this sort of what is the new rationale governing these kind of economic decisions. And that is a complex one for firms. I think the other question too is that what will encourage a firm, what will be the sort of final straw that will require a firm to consider relocation? Are they going to accept policy uncertainty for a certain number of years and not? What does this mean for smaller or medium-sized firms that really don't have a close link to understanding what's happening at the government level to be able to have a full understanding of how this will impact their supply chains? And then also in terms of some supply chains, like autos, for example, that have the 232 tariffs, particularly, for example, for Canada and the United States, those supply chains are so heavily integrated when you're thinking about it. Parts as a car is being built across the border all the time. And that's sort of the way of life of thinking about some of these complex supply chains. Things are not fabricated in one place anymore. And ultimately, these are sort of the complexities that firms will have to deal with that will be very difficult to do and implement. And yet you sort of have this blanket position of tariffs. And in the abstract, it seems like just a lot, but the complexity of actually what firms will have to do on the ground is so much more complicated than what we even can imagine at this point. And that's the real problem, is that firms then are not allocating resources to innovation or development or thinking about green industrialization or all the transformational sectors and digital questions we have to be thinking about, but instead how to navigate complex tariffs that, really if you were thinking about the global trading system, you didn't think necessarily that we'd be back to thinking about border measures in the same way that we are today.
You briefly mentioned, Trump sort of expected to use security almost as a sort of fig leaf around these tariffs. I imagine that there are, US allies right now who are doing genuine sort of calculations about whether actually the tariffs are worth accepting if there is a vow then somehow to protect the Western world rather than incur the costs of spending the cash to protect ourselves in a way that perhaps we never have done. Do you imagine that's going on in the background?
Well, one, it's not a question of governments accepting the tariffs or not. They have to accept them. It's what the United States is telling them they have to expect. So there's not a question of do they
I
accept them
just
or
mean
not.
no, without retaliation, effectively.
Oh, I honestly couldn't tell you what they'll expect. I think ultimately what you're asking is whether the United States' role as a security ally becomes intertwined with its role as an economic ally or an economic partner. And I do think, without sort of answering your question, that I can't answer what is going through the minds of governments at the moment, and I won't speculate on that. I do think that the United States, at least coming out of the Second World War, was seen as the world's banker to some extent with the establishment of the Marshall Plan, and also very much a security ally, and remains a security ally for a number of economies. And yet there is this open question about what the United States wants its role, both within global security and economics, to be. And ultimately, the United States really does sort of make things for itself. It doesn't rely on trade in the same way some other small open economies do, if you think about the United Kingdom or Canada, for example. And these questions about the intertwinement of security and economics are really a complicated question. And in fact, the United States itself is saying that its economy is a matter of national security. And that's a substantial broadening of how we understand security as otherwise a very traditional military defense position. So we're in this point now where we're muddling the concepts of both security and economics. And yet for some governments, they still see the United States as very emblematic of both buckets, but separately, right? As a key security ally, as having its own, military. And the pushback of that is that we're seeing governments sort of having to reclaim both, right? We're seeing a sort of recognition that governments must take care of their own economies. They must protect their own economies, and also they must be more aware of their security, right? And in terms of seeing, whether you're seeing in the media right now questions of nuclear power and also of defense, we're seeing governments begin to raise this in the public sphere. And I don't think that that's strictly because of the United States' tariff policies, and yet it's all coming to a head, I think, at this moment in time, not just because of the United States, but because of active conflicts that are going on around the world, and in terms of our understanding about what happened after the pandemic. So there's a lot of contingent factors that come into play. It's not just the United States' tariffs, but obviously as the leading sort of advanced economy, these questions are coming up because also we're seeing the United States sort of change their positioning, or at least we're at the beginning of seeing how they're changing their position.